For those of you who don't know me, my name is R.Earl. I'm Deputy Secretary of Policy Planning and Enterprise Services with the Maryland Department of Transportation. I'm a nearly 20-year career MDOT employee. I've been Deputy Secretary for almost 7 years. It's been a very interesting time. And one of the primary items that I've worked on as Deputy Secretary is a lot of items and issues related to climate change, resiliency, and preparing MDOT and the state's transportation infrastructure, working with lots of stakeholders for the future. So two of my colleagues are also here today. Sandy Hertz is here, who's Director of the Office of Climate Change, Resiliency, and Adaptation, that we actually set up about a year and a half ago in anticipation of needing dedicated resources to help us manage all the issues around climate change, around transportation. Also here is Heather Murphy, Director of Planning and Capital Programming. She's been around a while and has been intimately involved in these issues as well as we move forward, especially on the air side. We will be discussing how MDOT supports federal and state climate action strategies while still achieving our mission. One of the many questions I'm asked is, how does MDOT plan to assist with the state's overall goal of achieving a 60% greenhouse gas emission reduction over 2006 levels by 2031? Which is a very interesting question, a very challenging question, but as you know, challenges are to be overcome, and that's what our job is. And Sandy's going to touch base on her office's work across all our transportation business units to incorporate climate action strategies into each project that we do. So, another challenging job that also involves interacting with lots of stakeholders internally and externally with MDOT. One of the good things that I'm going to point out is you always want to start with successes. In July of 2020, the World Resource Institute ranked 41 states in the District of Columbia in their ability to decouple emissions and GDP growth. And Maryland ranked number 1. We continue to grow our economy while reducing our greenhouse gas emissions by 38%. That probably shouldn't surprise many people in this room, knowing Maryland's ethics in this area and how we've been working on this for a long time. So we're not just starting today with addressing these aggressive goals and challenging goals, but we know the reason why they're important in terms of doing everything that we can to reduce the impact of climate change for Maryland and the world, as well as making the air healthier for all of our communities across the state and making our transportation network as modern as possible while we're achieving these goals and also sustaining economic growth. I'd also add that the National Capital Region met their goal. I think they announced it a couple of weeks ago of a 20% reduction by 2020. The state of Maryland, in terms of the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Act, met its 25% goal by 2020. But now it gets interesting because we have more aggressive goals, obviously 60% by 2031 in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. I think COG has a 50% goal by 2030. You all know what the deal is there. So there's a lot that we're going to have to continue to do to work to achieve these goals. I would also add that, I think we're on slide 4. Mm-hmm. Okay. MDOT's already doing a lot, as we said, to lower greenhouse gas emissions. We've done this by switching to all electronic tolling statewide a year before the deadline. That was obviously helped the pandemic, unfortunately, helped us drive that faster than we had originally planned. But by keeping vehicles on the road moving, we're reducing congestion while also reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Department-wide, we're also transitioning to zero emission powered vehicles. We're working with other state agencies to achieve this. This includes MDOT MTA's bus fleet. As I previously mentioned, MDOT, in partnership with DNR, is also helping to expand our urban tree canopy and reduce heat islands in urban areas. A second question I'll get to before I go on is that what action does MDOT plan to take to ensure a resilient transportation system in Maryland? Well, just like how the Ravens showed their resiliency to finally hang on to a lead against the Browns this past Sunday, MDOT's also focused on building and maintaining assets to hold up the climate change while also lowering our greenhouse gas emissions. We're already working on achieving these goals with using new grant funds from the IIJA, which are very important to help us jumpstart a lot of our additional initiatives. Obviously, we're working on our National Vehicle Infrastructure, or NEVI plan. We're going to get more into detail during Heather's discussion of that. We have a focus on resiliency internal to our organization, and obviously MDOT's Urban Tree Program, grant program that we've already started to get dividends from. The focus on the environment is written into our mission statement. MDOT is to deliver safe, sustainable, intelligent, exceptional, and inclusive transportation solutions in order to connect our customers to life's opportunities. If you heard MDOT people speak, you've probably heard that before. The connecting to life opportunities is an important part of that because we don't want to, we don't want to restrict people's ability to do that as we try to work hard to meet these goals. Going back to the Urban Tree Program, in just the first year of the Urban Tree Program, we've awarded more than $18,000 to local groups to plant native Maryland trees in communities across Maryland. The applications for spring 2023 are being accepted through February 15, 2023, if you're interested in taking advantage of the funding that's available for that. Before we dive into deeper details, I want to mention the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. The IJA is not all new money. About 80% of it is funds you would have gotten anyway, but it also includes all the transportation formula funding, which are the funds we typically get. The projects of nearly $20 billion in terms of our CTP. I actually was in Frederick yesterday, and the night before I was here in Frederick City for the CTP presentation. For the draft FY 2023 to FY 2028. It's about $2.2 billion more than our previous CTP. So we really appreciate those additional assets to help move our initiatives forward. That being said, the IJA includes several new and existing funding sources to support emissions reductions and resiliency improvements in Maryland. These include CMAQ, NEVI, CRP, the PROTECT grant, and the BFP programs. There are limitations to eligible projects under each program, but they may also be combined with other federal aid programs to optimize our investments around projects and programs to achieve multiple benefits. So when we can get synergy, we're going to look for that. A lot of that involves working with local jurisdictions. One grant program I want to focus on is Maryland's NEVI plan. I have happened to be the chair of the Zero Emission Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Panel for the last almost 7 years. It's been a very rewarding experience, and we've made a lot of progress. Our NEVI plan was one of the first submitted nationally. It was submitted July 15th, so we beat the August 1st deadline that Federal Highway and the DOE Joint Office had put in place. Our plan then got approved by Federal Highway Administration on September 14th, giving Maryland the green light to start the planning process. We released a request for information RFI in late September to get feedback and recommendations for a future request for proposal for the development of electric vehicle charging networks within the state. Those RFIs responses due back today, the 26th. NEVI funding is for states to build out the EV charging infrastructure along designated alternative fuel corridors, such as our interstate highway network here in Maryland. The mission overall, the big picture mission, is to build a national network of 500,000 charging stations by 2030. So what the federal government wants to ensure is that anyone who buys an EV will be confident they can drive the interstate highway state network any place in the country and be able to find a charging station which is going to be operating and allow them to continue on their journey. And these are all going to be fast chargers that will allow them to recharge their vehicles in about 20 minutes to 30 minutes to 80% of a full charge for their vehicles. The requirements include an EV charging station with 4 fast chargers every 50 miles on the interstate within 1 mile of the highway. That was actually a tougher goal than the earlier 5 rounds of alternative fuel corridor designations, which have been 5 miles away from the interstate network. It makes sense to make it 1 because if I'm driving an EV along the interstate, I don't want to, especially if it's night, I don't want to have to be searching for an EV recharging station 5 miles away from my route. It'd be better if it's 1 mile. So that was common sense, I think. Though it's made it more challenging for us, and that now we have to go back and know we have to install more recharging along certain alternative fuel corridors that we thought already were fully compliant with the 5-mile requirement. But that's okay. That's part of the deal. In Maryland, we'll get approximately $60 million in formula funding over 5 years to increase our alternative fueling stations. Nationally, there's about $2.5 billion in discretionary grant money also going to be available over a 5-year period. I think it's going to go from like 300 million to 400 million to 500 million to 600 million to 700 million over those 5 years. We're hoping to get the guidance for the discretionary grant programs about mid-November, and that's going to give us additional grant opportunities. And I'm sure in some of those cases there will be local proposals from your counties and municipalities that you're going to want to work with us on getting things submitted to see if we can get some of that competitive grant money that Maryland over time has been pretty successful at getting. Maryland Levy Plan has 23 alternative corridors, 3 of which include hydrogen and propane, because one of the things that the legislature did 3 years ago when they basically re-upped ZVIC for being around to 2026, I believe, is that they added hydrogen to the portfolio in terms of ZVIC working with various partners to also build out a hydrogen fueling station network within the state. And right now we have 0 hydrogen fueling stations. In fact, in the whole East Coast of North America, I think there's 4, including Quebec province. So there are not that many in the East Coast, there's a lot in California, so we've got a lot of work to do there. As you can see, alternative fuel corridors crisscross the state, and they follow the path of our major interstate highway systems and major connected roads in Maryland. Part of our goal moving forward is to certify corridor pending areas into corridor ready, which is what I talked about earlier. This will help Maryland expand its already robust electric vehicle charging infrastructure that currently has 1,266 charging stations and 3,475 outlets as of September 30th. Maryland typically ranks in the top 5 or 10 states in terms of being ready for ZEV vehicles moving forward, and obviously our goal is to be number 1. California is undeniable number 1, but if you go by our greenhouse goals, we're number 1 now. So we're going to have to redouble our efforts to catch up to and pass California if we're going to meet our long-term goals. An expanded EV charging infrastructure is going to help us keep up with the exponential growth in vehicles. If you look at that, as of September 30th, we had 55,952 registered EVs in Maryland. That's over 1% of the total registered vehicles in the state. That might sound like a small number, but 10 years ago we had 609. So you can see the shape of that curve. As planners, you know what that means. If you've been watching TV, seen a lot of commercials, you know that the manufacturers are bringing out a whole lot of new EV models. If you ever go to an EV event, the Electric Vehicle Association of Greater Washington, D.C. puts this out every year, which shows all the EV models that are available from all the manufacturers. And let me say, when I first got involved with this, there was a lot of extra space on this page, and they're making the font smaller and smaller as more original equipment manufacturers add additional models available for sale. And the more models in the showrooms, the more options, the more people are going to buy them. I'm personally on the list for the Chevy Silverado. I got on in April, and they told me year-end 2024. So that's how long some of the vehicle lists are for EVs. Now we're growing at about 1,500 a month and accelerating, and we have an ambitious goal of 300,000 by 2025. I'm not sure if we're going to make that goal, but we're going to try. I will say that the goal for 2020 was 60,000. Obviously, we had a little thing, unfortunately, called the pandemic. The last couple of years, we're going to make that 60,000 goal by year-end 2022. So we're not that far behind, given what we've been having to deal with. 11 years ago, Maryland showed great vision by launching Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Council, which later became ZVIC. I would like to say that other state agencies are involved in that organization: the State Department of Energy, State Department of the Environment, Department of Commerce, Public Service Commission, the Department of Planning, and local jurisdictions with representatives from MACO, as well as the Municipal League. There are also members from higher education and other public and private stakeholders, environmental groups, like the Sierra Club, and many others, more than I can name. We've taken many important steps together to lay a foundation for Maryland's EV future. We're conducting community outreach and incentivizing EVs use through tax credits and rebates. I believe the tax credit will become available again July 1 of 2024 for EV purchases. Obviously, at the federal level, they're also added additional funding for vehicle tax credits as well. or at least rebates, and that's going to help people make the decision to jump on board the ZEV bandwagon. We're also using public-private partnerships to build charging stations around Maryland. As you all probably know, most EV recharging stations are owned by the private sector, not the public sector. That's important to recognize. There's a lot of different players in that field. Some are standalone EV companies, EV recharging companies. Some are owned by oil companies. Some are owned by automobile manufacturers. So it'll be interesting to see how that all falls out in the years ahead in terms of consolidation of the industry as we move forward and continues to grow from where it is now to an industry that's probably going to be 10 to 50 times as large as it is today, which creates a lot of opportunities. We're encouraged in working with state and local agencies to move ahead with their own fleet EV conversions. Of course, Maryland, the state, has to lead by example. As you may know, 20% of the passenger vehicles purchased for the state fleet must be zero-emission vehicles or hybrids. Maryland Transit Administration is going to convert 50% of its transit bus fleet to ZEV by 2030. Some of that IIJ money is going to help them do that. So it's probably going to cost about $500 million when the dust settles to convert half of our fleet, which is 350 buses, of the 700 bus total by 2030. And in March, MAA got $6.8 million for a contract approved by the Board of Public Works of Volkswagen money to buy 8 new battery electric zero-emission buses for BWI Marshalls. So in closing, we're already an idea factory for new initiatives. I could talk to you a long time. We don't have enough time for me to keep going. But we're considered a national leader. And now our challenge is to meet these more aggressive goals that we have to meet our legislator committed to long-term goals. So MDOT is involved with that. Obviously, addressing climate change is more than just EVs and ZEVs and lowering greenhouse gas emissions. There are other aspects of it that I know Heather's going to talk about, and especially Sandy, in terms of what we have to deal with in terms of being resilient to the additional water-related issues, stormwater and drainage issues and things of that nature, which also tie into addressing climate change and making sure Maryland can continue to grow its economy while dealing with these large challenges that we're going to face head on. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Heather.
Do you think your goals are realistic?
Our goals realistic?
Yes.
Well, I'll put that in context, okay? When we had the goals for the 2020, there were a lot of people who didn't think they were realistic, and we've actually come close to meeting them. We've met a bunch of them. You know, even the ZEV goal is a couple years late, but we're still on target. I think the big picture in terms of EVs, and if you look at EVs, especially light duty, okay, the technology is pretty much proven. And if you look at what the automobile manufacturers are saying, they're saying we're going to be converting our entire sales fleet in terms of the models to this big chunk by 2030 and everything else by 2035. So there may not be much choice but to buy a ZEV unless you buy a used internal combustion engine vehicle past 2035. So the other big picture that you need to understand is that an internal combustion engine vehicle has about 2,000 moving parts, and an EV has 20. That should tell you a lot about the cost of manufacturing and the cost of maintenance and the reliability. So part of what's going on here, and I can tell you a long story on the side about when I was in college in the early 80s, and I had professors say this will never happen, and here we are. So I think that's part of it. Now, are the goals realistic? They are aspirational goals. Okay. Now, the legislative goal, we have to come up with a plan to give us a chance to meet that goal. So, you know, ideally, we'll meet it by 2031. If it takes a little longer, so be it. But it's not because we're not trying. And obviously, there's lots of macro-related issues about various programs related to, you know, renewable portfolio for energy, building standards, and a host of others that are complex, which I know you all used to dealing with complex issues, and we do our best to meet what the state's goals are. So that would be my answer to your question. I wouldn't say they're unrealistic. I'd say they're challenging, but I'm an engineer at heart. Challenges are to be overcome. And if we give up before we start, then there's no way we're gonna get close to the goal. But if we really try to get there, which is what Marylanders do, we're the most innovative state in the country, right? We always have been. We got great people, we got smart people, and we always think of ourselves as leaders. So that's what we're going to do. You know, we're leading from the front or near the front. And what we want to do is we want to be smarter at doing it than California. And that's how we end up continuing to meet these aggressive goals, challenging goals, while still growing the economy. Because that's one of the things that, you know, Governor Hogan has said all along. We're open for business. You know, we've worked toward working with a lot of various goals, but it has to be with the threshold goal of we've got to continue to grow the economy and create opportunities for our people and businesses. That's it. Thanks.
I have one more question.
Yes.
So, with the current situation that occurred in California, they shut down the electric cars because of the electricity.
Yeah.
Has that been included in your plan? How do we,
I think issues like that are going to be discussed heavily between various stakeholders in this. As you know, the Maryland Public Service Commission is involved. We're like almost 3 years into a 5-year pilot working with the utilities. Okay. I'll just give this is my personal view, not as Deputy Secretary, okay?
From Deputy Secretary. Personal view. I wanted from the Deputy Secretary because, to roll out that many vehicles and then you not be able to use them, would be a tremendous issue.
I think the light-duty vehicle part of it is probably achievable, okay? Heavy-duty technology is maybe 10 years behind the light-duty vehicle technology, and also there are issues related to the cost of the recharging infrastructure for like the big trucks, because it's like an order of magnitude more expensive to do EV recharging for big trucks, and they also require significant capital investment because of the high loads you need to do battery electric. That's why the legislature a few years ago added hydrogen to the mix, and we'll have to figure out how we can make hydrogen clean. But that might be the better solution for larger trucks. I can quote Mary Barra, the chairman of GM, who a couple months ago I saw an interview of hers, and she said they internally have made the decision that the larger vehicles are going to be fueled by fuel cells and hydrogen. And that goes back to you probably have a lower cost of infrastructure and less likely to cause the issue we're all concerned about the electric grid by trying to put everything on battery electric vehicles. Because the grid right now can't support all that. And there's also a lot of federal money involved to grid modernization and continuing to put more renewables across the grid. I think I read someplace where, like in the NCR region, they've gone from like 500 to 51,000 rooftop solar installations in maybe 51 to 5,000 over the last decade and a half or so. So as things continue to develop, we'll get more visibility, but obviously we do not want to be in the situation that California is in. So that goes into, we want to be smarter than them in how we do this and move the various parts of this whole picture at a speed that makes sense based on the ability of us to build the infrastructure to support it.
And I would say, just to add on to what Deputy Secretary Lewis just said, MDOT has been a member and an active participant in the Maryland Commission on Climate Change since it began. And I can tell you through the mitigation working group, which Earl and I both sit in on those meetings, there have been many discussions about the capacity for our existing electric grid in Maryland to support not just the EV charging infrastructure and the conversion of our vehicles statewide to electric, but also the increased energy demand in buildings and around the state from moving away from natural gas as a source of fuel for heating and moving to all electric.
Yeah.
So it's certainly been a topic. I think when we approach our projects, and we have our goals for vehicles or our charge, no pun intended, for the NEVI program in terms of getting charging infrastructure out there. We're looking at it through what we can control within transportation, and the grid is obviously needed, and we have a voice at the table when we sit there in the commission meetings. However, it's likely going to be Public Service Commission, Maryland Energy Administration, and others that will be leading the force.
So, but how do you implement a program, in a silo? Because you can't implement, electric vehicle charging stations without collaboration and partnership with the utilities.
Correct.
It will not work that way. You'll have a project a product that cannot be utilized, and we'll be stuck with electric vehicles trying to meet a mandate.
Well, I will say this: the electric utilities have been a partner to this. Again, the PSC is 3 years into a 5-year process, which was preceded by a 3-year regulatory discussion about a pilot that will eventually likely become, real regulation in terms of utilities. The utilities, 5 of the state's largest utilities have been involved: BG&E, Pepco, Delmarva, SMECO, and Potomac Edison. So utilities actually attend every VBIC meeting. We meet every 2 months. So they are totally engaged. And again, if there are more electric vehicles, okay, the utilities are going to sell more electricity and make more money. So so they are interested in working with us to figure out how to make this work. Okay, so they are engaged. Sandy represents us on the mitigation working group of the Climate Change Commission, and anybody that knows me and listens knows that I will say the difficult things need to get said, but I'm not the only one. The chair of Maryland Motor Truck is on the mitigation work group, and he speaks up, and there's lots of other parties that speaks up. And if there's something we need to do, but there need to be caveats to do it, we'll vote to get those caveats in it. We need to accomplish this to be able to do this, and things of that nature. So I think the more everyone is engaged in the process moving forward, and like you, asking tough questions of our policymakers, regulators, the state, even the private sector. Part of the issue related to the signing up for various national initiatives, like we're California 177 state, we have been since 2007, is that doing that obligates the vehicle manufacturers to dedicate more of their ZEVs to Maryland. So that's part of the big picture of that. In order for people to buy them, they have to be available for sale. So there's going to be priority given to some states, given their being part of some of these consortiums. So that's part of the big picture of what's going on there. And again, the goals are challenging. I know we're running out of time, so I got to...
That's okay. We got a bunch.
Yeah.
If we can hold the rest of the questions to the end, that would be great.
Yeah. And I've got to leave about 5 or 12, but I have for conference call, but I'll be back. Yeah. And I'll be around till like 2:30, 3 o'clock.
We'll take your time.
All right, so I'm going to go quickly through a little bit more detail on the NEVI program. Earl hit a lot of the highlights. I think one of the interesting things with this program is it's very unique in terms of giving federal money to private entities. The idea is not that the state agencies or the counties or any other governmental entity is going to build these. The idea is to give this money to private entities to partner with the utilities and with private property owners to get these chargers where we need them. So that is going to raise a lot of challenges. But we will work through that, and we have been, as Earl said, our RFI, so our trying to get questions out there, closes today at 2. The next step will be working with the joint office. This is a joint Federal Highway Department of Energy at the federal level initiative, so it's really looking at not just the transportation side, but the energy side, and that would be the utilities as well. So we're looking at that. So obviously, I'm going to talk real quickly. Part of what we also have to look at is equity. As Earl said, these the initial NEVI money is for those interstates. If we can get Maryland in compliance and get all of our charging along the major interstates done with the initial money, that leaves us for community charging, which is where we can really address equity, looking at rural areas of the state and looking at disadvantaged communities and trying to get charging in those areas. It doesn't have to be that really fast charging. It could be what's called level 2, which is more like you're plugging in your dryer at home versus a really fast, highly energy dependent DC fast chargers that we talked about. But certainly making this affordable, making sure that this isn't for the elite, that everybody can own an EV, be able to charge. Hopefully the idea is that you are charging your car for much less money than you are putting gas in your gas-powered car. And obviously the communication is key, and we've done a lot of outreach, and we will continue. We did a lot of webinars. They were probably aimed a little bit more at stakeholders, but we've also been out in the communities trying to do as much research as we can on what people need and getting input from the general citizens. And we've tried to go around the state and really focus as much as we can in some of the more rural and disadvantaged communities, because that's going to be hopefully our next step that gets you past that traveling public. I mean, really that initial NEVI money, the idea is people who are traveling long distance. That's where you stop at rural farms, you go charge your car on that fast charger, go in, use the restroom, get your lunch, come back in 20 minutes, and you're back fully charged. That works for the traveling public. If you've ever read any of the stories, there's a bunch of people who try to go across Montana. It took them like 15 hours to get across Montana because there aren't these chargers out there. The idea of this federal program is to get that impediment gone, but then we really need to focus on our equity areas and where we need to work. All right. That only leaves me with... go back. But one of the things I did want to touch really quickly on is kind of the role of the local governments. This is going to have to be a very large partnership, and some of the things that we as a state entity don't have responsibility for is a lot of the permitting, the local permitting. When they go put these chargers in, somebody's going to have to say that they're being done correctly and they're okay. There's going to be a lot of push to have those kind of things go quickly, so we are going to try to engage those entities very quickly. As I said, once we get into that community area, there's going to be a lot more work on where to put those, where they will have the most effect. Obviously, we've kind of talked about these being private entities. They want to make money. There are a lot of chargers in this state already, but they are generally in areas where these private entities think they can make money. It's where the chargers are needed because it's where the electric vehicles are today. We need, as a government entity, to kind of step in and put those more into areas where they won't necessarily be able to recoup the money on installing the chargers. If we install the chargers or have the funding to give them to install the chargers, then they can be able to maintain them and charge for that electricity and not have a losing effort and not want to be there. So I think that was kind of what I was looking at, and I'm going to turn this over to Sandy, kind of hit some of the non-EV pieces, because there's a lot of that we need to do as well. And
the one last EV thing I'll add, though, is that the federal government being involved and the Maryland Public Service Commission being involved is going to result in standards of availability and reliability of the recharges. It looks like it's going to be like 97% plus or minus, which is above where we are right now, which is about between 70 and 80%. And that's going to make a big difference to people feeling that they can get electricity when they need it in their driving vehicles. Yes.
All right, so I get the fun part of coming up and talking about funding and programs that are already in place at MDOT. Earl mentioned earlier that last year we started an urban tree program within Maryland Department of Transportation. It's actually run out of my office. And in the first year, we had given out, I think it's close to $20,000 in funding to 6 different organizations, resulted in just under 400 trees being planted in urban areas in Maryland. One of the unique things, I think it's the next slide, Heather. It's actually a partnership that we established with the Department of Natural Resources. So we have been, I guess, piggybacking on their efforts under the Urban Forestry Committee there. They actually have the Maryland Urban and Community Forest Committee that runs the DNR grant program for urban tree planting. And so we added additional funding through MDOT towards those. And actually last year, I think I had a certain pot of funding, and this year when I was talking to Earl, he said, double it. So I said, okay. So we actually have twice as much money this year for giving out funding to plant trees in communities this year. The tree planting projects, if they're just tree planting projects, are eligible for up to $5,000 in reimbursement for things like plant materials, site prep, the actual equipment that they can use multiple times, so shovels and stakes, they can actually apply for that as part of the grant application. There is no requirement for matching funds. However, it's strongly encouraged. Makes it an easier lift if we have some buy-in through investment from the communities as well. In addition, we this year started, the spring grant cycle, we really only had the individual trees and tree planting projects. Starting this fall, we added in a concept of building pocket forests in urban areas, and that's something that was largely established. It was a Japanese technique, and essentially it covers everything from, the substrate, the base planting material, to the understory, to the herbaceous layer and the ground covers, as well as the canopy itself. And the concept is that you densely plant these smaller pocket forests so that they have increased rate of maturity and basically the impacts to the communities in terms of carbon sequestration and shading and air quality. So, and those are eligible for more than 5,000. It's kind of dealt with on a case-by-case basis. We have a preference for communities that have environmental justice concerns or that have had that suffer from extreme heat related to impervious cover. And the one thing that I failed to say at the very beginning of all this is that they have to be tied to a transportation project that resulted in tree removal previously. So that is and it has to be a state transportation project. So that is the caveat there. And there is more up on DNR's website, and hopefully soon we will have it up on the MDOT website too. So if you're interested, we are on the same page as the Maryland Urban and Community Forest Committee page. Next slide. So I'm going to go back to staying on the trend of reducing emissions and carbon, and talk about one of the new formula programs that we received through Federal Highway this year. And I'm talking about the federal fiscal year 22 apportionments. We're now in 23, but we are expecting that the level of funding is going to be fairly consistent over the next 5 years. So in 2022, we received $18.1 million in carbon reduction program funding. The aspect of it that I'm sure you all would be very interested in is that 65% of our annual allocation under the carbon reduction program needs to go to specific areas of the state based on population. So there's a fact sheet that I have in the slide deck that I think will be shared with all of you that spells out those separations, but basically it's 200,000 and above, it's just under 200 to 50,000, and then 49,999 to 5,000, and then there's another category for under 5,000. So it's basically urban areas and then the lesser populated areas of the state. The other 35% of that 18.1 million could be spent in any area of the state, and it can also be moved over to those other areas. It just depends on the types of projects that are out there that help with the overall goal of the program, which is reducing carbon emissions from transportation. So how the projects need to meet that primary purpose for the funding. We also have to put together a carbon reduction strategy, which is actually due by next November 15th, 2023. And one of the key parts of it that will be shown on the next slide, not this, don't advance yet, I will get into, and that kind of will speak to all of you in the audience, I think, today. Some of the projects that are eligible for carbon reduction program funding, we can actually use the funding to develop our carbon reduction strategy for the state of Maryland. You can also use it for traffic monitoring and control facilities or programs, public transportation projects like transit. On and off-road bike and ped facilities is another one that qualifies, and the idea is that you are possibly switching somebody from doing a single occupancy vehicle mode of travel to maybe biking to where they need to go or walking to where they need to go. Advanced transportation and congestion management technologies. That could be anything from taking your traffic data and identifying areas where you have congestion occurring and figuring out ways to change your signalization to make the flow easier, or go to cashless tolling and just have everybody run right through where they used to have to stop at the Bay Bridge. Energy efficient street lighting. So they're all kind of listed here. Again, I do have the fact sheet that kind of goes into more of the details, and there's actually also a supporting program guidance document that's on the FHWA website that is available for anybody to look at. Next slide. So, by show of hands, because I think you all have fallen asleep, how many of you have either been designated the queen or king of party planning in your agencies or just in life in general? How many of you have had to handle coming up with a plan for a group of individuals at any point in your life? I don't even care. All right, now put your hands up. And out of those people that have done that, how many of you had everybody satisfied? Yeah. So this slide kind of speaks to that, and it kind of speaks to your question earlier about how do you address some of these plans in a silo. Well, we're not trying to do it in a silo. It's one of the reasons that we have this roadshow. But also, in addition to trying to kind of coordinate with everybody around priorities that are happening in your jurisdictions, and even at the state level, we have what I like to call carbon reduction strategy influencers. Others might call challenges, or not barriers, but just challenges, considerations. So at the federal level, on this left side, we have similar goals around equity, for example, Justice 40. So at the federal level, if we are making investments with federal transportation dollars, the goal for all federal agencies is to invest 40% of that in areas that are underserved communities. We have the National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure component. Carbon reduction strategy. Yay, that's the one we're working on. Vision Zero. For us, Vision Zero is towards zero deaths on our highways. So we have a safety aspect that we're thinking about as we plan this strategy. You have your transportation asset management plans. We have that for Maryland State Highway Administration as well as Maryland Transit Administration. But in addition, every one of our business units have identified their critical infrastructure as it relates to climate change and extreme weather impacts in particular. So that's on the federal side. Then on the state side, you have similarities, Justice 40, equity. We have same kind of thing for them. We have the same goals in terms of net zero and net zero for greenhouse gas emissions. Sometimes they are in complete sync and it's like, yay, everybody's talking, and then sometimes they're slightly off track. And then in addition, and Earl touched on this a little bit, we have industry. We have, the Maryland Trucking Association. We have the dealerships in Maryland in terms of electric vehicles and the amount of stock that they're actually getting in place. So all of these different influencers play a role in ultimately developing that strategy by next November 15th. It's not going to be like a paralysis by analysis type situation, hopefully, but it does just speak to the complexity of developing a statewide carbon reduction strategy. And then the last part, but not least, is this block over here, the MPOs and locals. When we come up with our strategy to reduce carbon and use this funding, we need to do it in coordination with the MPOs. So kind of going back to the party planning concept, I had one of my staff look at all 7 MPOs and develop a spreadsheet that showed the high-level vision statements and the goals listed for the MPOs, and by and large, they were pretty much in sync. Then you get to the local priorities letters, and there's 24 of them that we receive every year. And what happened was we had the top 3 priority needs from all 23 letters come out as bike ped. That's awesome because that fits under ERP, as well as transit. And the third one was capacity. That's probably not awesome because capacity means highway widening or adding vehicles on the road. So there's some challenges even within the priorities at the county level that we need to think about as we're pulling together our carbon reduction strategy. So here's where we were a little bit about a year ago today. We had EJA enacted. It took them until late April to let us know what the guidance was going to be for the carbon reduction program, and within 3 weeks we began our analysis for the CRS development. And that analysis means things like doing modeling to determine what the vehicles are right now, looking at different planning scenarios in order to achieve the best reduction towards our state target, which, as Earl said earlier, is 60% by 2031. So going all the way forward, due dates here, we find out in mid-February of 2024 if Federal Highway, or actually the Secretary of the U.S. Department of Transportation, accepts our carbon reduction strategy. One thing that I want to add is that this block here where we talk about the draft CPP incorporating CRS priorities, one of the things we're hoping for in the next round of engagement with the locals and the MPOs is that you identify for us what your priorities are that align with the carbon reduction program when you give us projects to consider. Next slide. All right. I only have 2 slides for this, so we should be Protect is another one of the new formula programs that we received, and it was about, I think it was 26 million, something like that. It's a little over 20 million in new funding. 2% of that has to be set aside every year for planning, which is awesome. And we will be working on what is called a Transportation Resilience Improvement Plan for MDOT, and it's already been kicked off. If we develop a resilience improvement plan, it actually allows us to lower our non-federal match requirements for our projects. Right now, every time we do a project under most of the highway federal aid program, it is an 80-20 split. So 80% of it is federal dollars, 20% of it is state match. If we are able to develop a resilience improvement plan that's also incorporated at the MPO level, it adds another 3%. So we can go from a 20% match requirement to a 10% match requirement. So you're saying, well, why does that matter? Probably. But it matters from the standpoint that it frees up more state funding to go after additional projects that are needed from a system preservation or other standpoint across the state. So it's almost like we can do a better way of optimizing our available funds. And then the last slide, I think, is just the eligible projects that are under Protect. And Kevin, this kind of might resonate with you from your MDE hat. It can cover things like flooding. It can cover, issues where you might have landslides and erosion occurring in your districts or in your counties. It can look at things like evacuation routes. And to me, being, I guess, in this space 24/7 now, I don't see CRP and Protect as being two separate program areas. I think, if you're doing resiliency planning correctly and, really making a difference in resolving those issues, then you should have a byproduct that might be congestion mitigation, right? And then now you're not having isolated areas where folks are idling because they can't get from point A to point B. So I feel like they're also complementary to each other. And so one of the things that we're currently doing, and I didn't mention this under CRP, but it's kind of ongoing, is the funding came to us last fall by legislation. We didn't actually have it hit our books until sometime like April this year. And we don't want to not spend the money on the right types of projects. They need to be consistent with the program areas. And so we're being deliberate in our approach and approaching and looking at the existing projects we have in the CTP and the draft CTP. And that's just because we have those projects already identified. And some of them may very well qualify for this funding. But next year, like I mentioned earlier, what we're hoping is that you all can let us know which projects you have that you feel fit under these types of programs, so that they can be considered as part of the CRS and the resilience group. And I think that's it for me.
Now, Earl's not here, but we already got questions.
Yes.
Go for it.
Everything that you kind of talked about today is kind of talking about the travel program and how everybody's going to get to point A to point B. What's being done as far as the living environment? Like once people get home and how they, are there going to be requirements that they have to have charging stations as a new house is being built, or building codes going to be changed? In the older cities, a lot of us are dealing with local communities. So where are these stations going to be done? You can't have extension cords going out across the sidewalk. So it's that local environment that, and generally what happens is all the money from the feds gets pumped into this part of it. So yeah, we got to get it ready. But then when it comes down to the local level, we get requirements that say you just have to do this, but there's no money for it.
Yeah.
So is that even being discussed? What is that sounding like in relationship to the 2031?
Yeah, that is definitely being discussed. We know that there is an equity concern really around even purchasing electric vehicles, not even just from the price point alone, but also we have a large number of Marylanders that live in multi-unit dwellings. They have, or they're in a built-out area like, Baltimore City, where there's just not space to put in charging infrastructure. The short answer would be that those types of discussions have been occurring, and it does involve things like changing the building code. Last General Assembly, they passed the Climate Solutions Now Act of 2022, and I don't know if it remained in there. I think it did. There were components within that bill that spoke about requiring new construction to have to provide for electric vehicle charging and energy reductions as well in some areas. So I think, and then at the federal level, there's also that type of focus. That's part of what the Justice 40 component under CRP would be speaking to, and that is, how do we make sure that the folks that do go out and buy these vehicles have the ability to charge them at home and access to them in their communities. And so I'm not saying that there's like a easy button anybody can hit to get to where to put them, but it's definitely something that the funding is able to be used on. When do you start?
When with the new structures that come in, when do you start saying, especially with our planning commissions, that that's something they should be looking at when they're looking at a new development, and saying, do we want to have these scattered all over the community, and then they finally realize
well, what I can say is that at MDOT, what we've been doing, and so we have an issue right now, and that is that we can't put electric vehicle charging infrastructure in our federal aid right-of-way. And that's a Code of Federal Regulations uphill battle that was raised a while ago. So what we have been doing is when we're doing renewable energy projects, so we have 2 active renewable solar energy. Yes. We can't put them in park and rides. We can't put them in our rested areas.
Yes. When you're right away on the highway of an interstate.
Yeah.
But I think the gist is there's a lot of different obstacles we know. Really the community, we're only able to deal with it at the state level. But it's really the legislature and the Climate Change Commission that are looking at those areas and looking at when is the right time to force people to do things, because when it makes economic sense, people are doing them. There's chargers all over the place where those charging companies think they can make money. It's a lot harder when you start getting into the built environment where there isn't as much space.
So our approach at MDOT has been to, when we're doing the renewable projects for solar, for example, we're actually having part of the contract for them to put it in with readiness for electric vehicle charging infrastructure. And so, I would say that if you're not requiring it as part of, new developments, readiness or the ability to provide that type of service would be something that I would be doing already.
Once they've already dug it up, it's very easy to put some conduit down. It's a lot harder to dig it up in the first place.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know. Well, let me go there. Go ahead.
Oh, okay. So looking at the timelines and everything, is the supply chain, we all know that, lumber's finally come down, but unfortunately, we were closely with Potomac Edison because the transformer small little part is not component that's so cheap. So this time last year, we're about another year out for some of the transformers to go in a finished neighborhood. That's going to affect not grid, that's affecting just purely. So the timelines is how do you, with a nutshell game, be able to even put a date together? Because I saw that the U.S. Department of Secretary is going to be looking at it in February of 2024, the recommendations that you put together. Similar to the Climate Solutions Act with new construction too. That work group has got to go. How do you account for supply chain challenges like that? We're literally a year out now.
A lot of that's just spending the money.
Yeah.
So a lot of our plans it doesn't really matter when we deal with this is what we want to do. It's the time frame. How quickly can you get there? And we've had, actually I think Potomac Edison is the one that we have an electric charging infrastructure project with them that is sitting because they're waiting for transformers to come in. What we're trying to do is a lot of the money is fairly flexible on our side. So generally, when you get the money, you need to obligate it that year. This is all federal general fund money that's being spent on the NEVI and a lot of the carbon reduction and protect. You actually have 3 years in which to, 4 years in which to obligate it. So we have some time to hopefully overcome some of those challenges, and that is something that we are constantly bringing up to US DOT, that there are supply chain issues that we can't control. And Buy America is a big thing that is causing supply chain issues. So we're trying to get exemptions on the NEVI front to not have to have as much Buy America, at least in the beginning, and try to get that industry brought back into the U.S. is their plan. So.
And I'd like to put a plug in because the existing construction is much greater than the new construction, and a lot of what we heard earlier today, that those incentives for remodeling or commercial properties to be able to put in, all of that's already existed. So those funds, as opposed to new, are the ideal.
Yes.
So that's today.
No, but that's a good point.
Other fuels, gas and diesel, are sold by the gallon to consumers. All right, and the prices vary widely depending on the area. Okay, and then also they're taxed depending on the area, state and federal taxes. Okay, so that affects the price of fuel that we're all paying for. All right, so for an EV charging station, number one, 2 questions: how the price is set on that, not the ones you're using at your house. All right, because I'm ignorant, I have no idea at all about that. And then the taxes that are levied upon gasoline and oil, those taxes are targeted for infrastructure for highways, highway user funds, and things like that.
Yes.
So, how do you
I don't deal with it. How do you
charge for electric?
So the one thing with the electricity is it's all controlled by the Public Service Commission. So the utilities do not have the ability to say, the demand's higher here, you're going to pay twice as much as the person over here. The Public Service Commission controls the price of electricity.
So all EV stations, the price is the same?
Well, that's the electricity. The electricity that you purchase will be the same.
Okay.
There is the element of the profit, the service charge on there. So the Public Service Commission is trying to set up ways to control that as well. So that the idea is that when you buy your electricity, your charging spot out in Garrett County, it will be the same as in Montgomery County. So the Public Service Commission is working on that so that there are controls on that extra fee. Standards on the prices.
Right. State, pretty much the same, Joe?
It's all controlled state to state.
Okay.
But a lot of it has to do with how they get the electricity.
Okay.
And, where it's more expensive, if it's higher renewable, those tend to be more expensive at this point. Coal, which nobody seems to like on that side, tend to be much cheaper. So, but they're not as variable as, you're not paying $6 a gallon in California and $2.50, in, I don't know, wherever. On the other side, you hit my heart in the taxes. If you remember, Earl said I have the planning and capital programming. I'm in charge of the capital program that we put together, which is a document about this thick. It spends a whole lot of money. We are, at this point, watching what to do. Obviously, if we get to a point where there are no or very few...
That's where I was going.
Cars, there's a lot of talk nationally on things that make people nervous, mileage-based user fees. So instead of paying by your gallon, which actually we actually charge at the wholesale price, so the wholesalers are the ones that pay us the taxes. So one of the questions I always get is, well, how much does my county contribute? Well, I have no idea because we get it at the wholesale level. But that is something we're watching. Mileage-based user fees are thought about, ways to actually get a fee on that electric charging equipment. So if you're charging outside of the house, There could be ways of collecting from the utilities. When you plug in at your house, it's just your utility bill.
Sure.
So if you've got a level 2 charger and you're charging, you usually want to do it overnight because the rates are cheaper, because they also have a rate system that's based on time of day. So there's a lot of things being discussed at a national level. I think it's a national solution. It's not something that Maryland can do.
Currently, there's no contribution
So
to EV charging to
correct. Currently, there's not.
infrastructure on roads.
But as Earl said, there's about 55,000 of 4 whatever million cars in the state. So right now it is not affecting our revenues. Actually, hybrid cars are affecting our revenues much more.
Yeah, sure.
How many people have a hybrid versus an EV? This much have hybrids. My standard phrase is, you used to travel 200 miles in a week. Now, instead of us getting money for that 200 miles, it's like us getting money for 100 miles, because your hybrid car gets twice as much gas mileage. So we've been dealing with it, and I think at the federal level, that's why there's a lot of money from the federal general fund that's gone into the infrastructure bill instead of the gas tax, because it's not going up. The amount of money we get from the gas tax is going down, but it's something we're dealing with on a national level, and AASHTO and those kind of people have been dealing with it.
I did get the stink eye from somebody that I think
We're well
has been
past.
served, but if you have a quick question, okay?
Is there any other consideration on going to the mode of transportation?
There is,
Yes.
That's a good question. So both Protect and CRP have flexibility in the funding for other surface transportation. So, for example, at the port facility, we have drayage trucks that come in and out picking up those big freight containers. If we were to do an improvement related to their, coming in and out of the port, that is one example of a surface transportation project that funding could be flexed over. In addition, there is the ability to flex some of the carbon reduction programs, I think it's also Protect, over to transit. And we've done that in the past for our CMAQ program, which is congestion mitigation and air quality. And we send some of the federal highway money up through to FTA and then back down to MTA for them to purchase buses and convert over to electric. So, thank you guys for your attention and for